Our journey into the historical roots of economic disparities affecting Black Americans begins with the brutal institution of slavery, a system that forcibly brought millions of Africans to the shores of the United States. Enslaved people were stripped of their rights, humanity, and the ability to accumulate wealth, serving as unpaid labor that built much of the nation's early economy. As we explore the turbulent Reconstruction era that followed the Civil War, we witness the fleeting hope for equality and the swift imposition of oppressive Jim Crow laws that reinstated systemic barriers. The Great Migration saw millions of African Americans move northward in search of better opportunities, only to encounter new forms of discrimination. By understanding these foundational events, we uncover how historical injustices have laid the groundwork for contemporary economic disparities. The institution of slavery, which lasted from the early 17th century until 1865, was not just a system of forced labor, but a comprehensive economic engine that benefited slaveholders and the broader American economy. Enslaved Blacks were denied the right to own property, receive wages, or accumulate any form of wealth. Their labor contributed to the prosperity of industries such as cotton, tobacco, and sugar, which were cornerstones of the national economy. This lack of wealth accumulation had a multi-generational impact, as wealth is often passed down through families to provide educational opportunities, property ownership, and financial security. Being a slave removed that possibility or opportunity. The end of the Civil War in 1865 brought about the Reconstruction era, a period marked by significant but short-lived progress for Black Americans. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments aimed to abolish slavery, grant citizenship, and protect voting rights. During this time, some Black Americans were able to own land, start businesses, and hold public office. However, this progress was met with fierce resistance. The Compromise of 1877 led to the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction and leaving Black Americans vulnerable to the resurgence of white supremacy. Jim Crow laws emerged in the late 19th century as a formalized system of racial segregation and disenfranchisement. These laws mandated the separation of races in public spaces, education, employment, and housing. Black Americans were systematically denied access to quality education, restricted from certain jobs, and faced barriers to voting through literacy tests and poll taxes. The economic impact was profound. Limited job opportunities kept Black workers in low-paying, menial positions, while discriminatory lending practices prevented them from owning homes or businesses. This institutionalized racism ensured that Black Americans remained at the lower rungs of the economic ladder, with no ability to climb that ladder. From approximately 1916 to 1970, there was a mass movement of over 6 million Black Americans from the rural South to the urban North and West, known as the Great Migration. Driven by the oppressive conditions of the Jim Crow South, characterized by racial violence, lack of economic opportunities, and disenfranchisement, many sought better prospects in industrial cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Los Angeles. Initially, the Great Migration offered improved economic opportunities. Northern industries, especially during World War I and World War II, had a high demand for labor due to the decreased European immigration and increased production needs. Black migrants found work in factories, steel mills, and shipyards, often earning higher wages than they could in the agricultural South. However, these opportunities were limited and came with new challenges. Black workers were often relegated to the most dangerous and lowest-paying jobs. Labor unions frequently excluded them, and they faced hostility from white workers who saw them as competition. Housing discrimination was rampant. Practices like redlining and restrictive covenants confined Black residents to overcrowded and under-resourced neighborhoods. This segregation led to the development of urban ghettos, with limited access to quality education, healthcare, and public services. Moreover, the economic gains made during this period were undermined by systemic racism in the North. While not codified like Jim Crow laws, de facto segregation and discrimination persisted. The economic disparities experienced by Black Americans in the North mirrored those in the South, albeit in different forms. The inability to secure loans, purchase homes in certain areas, or access quality education perpetuated a cycle of poverty and limited upward mobility. You have to understand that early discriminatory policies were instrumental in shaping the socioeconomic landscape for Black Americans by legally enforcing segregation and limiting access to resources necessary for economic advancement. Apart from Jim Crow laws, policies such as the Black Codes, enacted immediately after the Civil War, sought to control the labor and behavior of former slaves and other African Americans. These codes restricted freedom of movement, criminalized unemployment, and limited the types of jobs Black people could hold, effectively forcing them back into exploitative labor arrangements like sharecropping. Think about it, the Homestead Act of 1862, which provided millions of acres of land to settlers, largely excluded Black Americans due to discriminatory practices and violence that prevented them from claiming land. Similarly, the Social Security Act of 1935 initially excluded agricultural and domestic workers, the majority of whom were Black, from benefits, denying them a safety net that was available to white America. The Federal Housing Administration, FHA, established in 1934, implemented underwriting guidelines that institutionalized redlining. Neighborhoods with Black residents were deemed high risk and were marked in red on maps, leading to denial of mortgages and home loans in those areas. This prevented Black families from purchasing homes, a primary means of wealth accumulation in the United States for the majority of Americans, Black, white, or otherwise. Lastly, educational disparities were cemented through unequal funding of schools. Segregated schools for Black children received fewer resources, resulting in inferior educational facilities and opportunities. This educational gap limited access to higher education and better paying jobs, perpetuating economic inequality. Systemic racism became embedded in American institutions through laws, policies, and practices that explicitly or implicitly favored white Americans while disadvantaging Black Americans. Legislation at the federal, state, and local levels codified discriminatory practices. For example, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, upheld the separate but equal doctrine, providing legal justification for segregation across all public facilities, including schools, transportation, and accommodations. In the judicial system, Black Americans faced biased legal practices. All-white juries, discriminatory sentencing, and unequal legal representation contributed to a justice system that disproportionately punished Black individuals. Voter suppression tactics such as literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses systematically disenfranchised Black voters, effectively silencing their political voice and ensuring that laws continued to reflect the interests of the white majority. Economic institutions also perpetuated systemic racism. Banks and lending institutions engaged in discriminatory lending practices, denying loans to Black applicants regardless of creditworthiness. Labor unions often excluded Black workers or relegated them to the lowest paying jobs. These institutional practices were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader system that maintained racial hierarchies. What do I mean? Education systems reinforced systemic racism through segregated schools and curricula that marginalized Black history and contributions. The lack of representation and resources in educational institutions limited opportunities for social and economic advancement. Furthermore, media and cultural institutions propagated stereotypes and narratives that dehumanized Black Americans, influencing public perception and justifying discriminatory practices. These portrayals reinforced societal norms that accepted or ignored systemic inequalities. The historical injustices faced by Black Americans have direct parallels to present-day economic challenges. The wealth gap between Black and white Americans persists, with the median white household possessing significantly more wealth than the median Black household. This disparity is rooted in the historical denial of wealth accumulation opportunities through slavery, discriminatory policies, and segregation. Redlining's legacy is evident in the continued segregation of neighborhoods and the underinvestment in predominantly Black communities. These areas often lack access to quality education, healthcare, and employment opportunities, perpetuating cycles of poverty. The effects of discriminatory housing policies contribute to disparities in homeownership rates, property values, and the ability to pass wealth to future generations. Employment discrimination remains a barrier. Studies have shown that job applicants with white-sounding names receive more callbacks than those with Black-sounding names, indicating ongoing bias in hiring practices. Occupational segregation persists, with Black workers overrepresented in lower-paying service jobs and underrepresented in higher-paying professional roles. Educational disparities continue to affect economic outcomes. Schools in predominantly Black neighborhoods often receive less funding, leading to larger class sizes, fewer resources, and lower graduation rates. This educational gap affects access to higher education and competitive job markets. The criminal justice system's disproportionate impact on Black Americans echoes the injustices of the past. Mass incarceration rates are higher among Black individuals, and a criminal record can significantly hinder employment prospects, housing opportunities, and the ability to vote. This modern iteration of disenfranchisement parallels the voter suppression tactics of the Jim Crow era. Healthcare disparities exacerbated by historical neglect are evident in the disproportionate impact of diseases like hypertension, diabetes, and more recently, COVID-19 on Black communities. Limited access to quality healthcare and environmental factors contribute to these health challenges, which in turn affect economic stability due to medical expenses and lost income. Systemic racism embedded in institutions continues to shape policies and practices that disadvantage Black Americans. For instance, predatory lending practices led to higher foreclosure rates among Black homeowners during the 2008 financial crisis, wiping out significant portions of Black wealth. Understanding the historical context of economic disparities affecting Black Americans is crucial to addressing the systemic inequalities that persist today. The legacy of slavery, Reconstruction's unfulfilled promises, and the entrenchment of Jim Crow laws established a foundation of systemic racism that became embedded in American institutions. Early discriminatory policies shaped the socioeconomic landscape by denying Black Americans access to wealth accumulation, quality education, fair employment, and political representation. The Great Migration, while offering hope for better opportunities, highlighted the pervasive nature of discrimination as Black Americans faced new forms of segregation and economic barriers in the North and West. The parallels between past injustices and present-day challenges are stark. The wealth gap, employment discrimination, educational inequities, and systemic biases in criminal justice and healthcare systems are not new phenomena, but are rooted in historical practices. Addressing these disparities requires a comprehensive understanding of their origins and the ways in which historical injustices continue to influence current economic conditions. Policies aimed at rectifying these inequalities must consider the deep-seated nature of systemic racism and the need for structural changes in institutions. By acknowledging the past and its impact on the present, society can work towards creating equitable opportunities for all, ensuring that the future does not mirror the injustices of the past.